6 months after my husband's funeral. His brother showed up on my doorstep, and the first thing I felt wasn't grief, it waster not of him, but of the sudden treacherous pulse of life in a house I thought, for a decade had been a beautiful solent tomb. My carefully constructed a fragile thing built on routine and numbness was about to be shattered. For 182 days I had played the part, oft grieving widow to perfection. I was Claire, 38, the woman left behind by the brilliant formidable Richard Ashworthy wore black, but not the theatrical creep of a broken woman. I wore thottled, elegant black of a woman managing her sorrow with quiet dignity. I received guests in the cavernous living room of our Boston brownstone, accepting their casseroles and their hollow condolences. With a serene sad smile they saw a woman upholding the legacy of a great man. They didn't see a prisoner, who had just been handed the keys to her own cage. Richard had been a force of natura, renowned architect, 20 years my senior, built monuments of steel and glass, and who had with the same cool precision construct our life. I was his most beautiful design, an accessory to his success displayed at galas and dinner parties, always smiling, always agreeably always absent. Our marriage was a map of emotional distance, a long quiet corridor where we passed each other like polite ghosts. His sudden death from a heart attack hadn't felt like a tragedy, it felt like a change in air pressure. The silence he left behind was empty, it was breathable. That afternoon I was in his study, the one room that had always been his sanctuary, a place I rarely entered when he was alive. It smelled of old leather, whiskey, and him. It was a room that still held his ghost captive. I was sorting through his papers, a task the estate lawyer insisted was necessary, but for me it was a strange, transgressive act of archaeology, digging through the layers of a man I had lived with but never truly known. That's when the doorbell chimed, a sound so rare it made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. My performance sexual was clear for the day. Peeking through the curtains I saw him. Julian, Richard's younger brother, the family's beautiful disaster, stood on the steps, not with a suitcase, but with a battered leather satchel slung over his shoulder, looking less like a mourner and more like a wanderer who had taken a wrong turn. I hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since a disastrous Christmas dinner where he and Richard had argued about Julian's refusal to live a respectable life at 25. He was the antithesis of his brother, where Richard was rigid stone and polished mahogany. Julian was flowing water and unhoneyed wood, an artist who drifted through life chasing light and inspiration. He was a walking embodiment of everything Richard disdained: passion and stability and freedom. My hand trembled as I opened the heavy oak door. Julian, I sighed, my voice a little too breathless. He looked at me, his eyes, a startling, piercing blue so unlike Richard's cool gray, swept over me, and in them I saw an apathy. I saw an unnerving, unwelcome prescription. He wasn't looking at the grieving widow, he was looking at Clara Hilo. Claire, he said, his voice a growly tenor that was nothing like his brother's clipped baritone I heard with a pond. I came as soon as I could. He had been in Southeast Asia chasing sunsets. He'd later tell me you should have called, I said, the hostess in medicing, over a familiar shield. Richard never answered my calls. He replied, Asmel, bitter smile playing on his lips, I figured I'd try my luck with you. The statement hung in the air between USA shared truth about the man who connected and divided us. I stepped back, a silent invitation, and he walked into the house, bringing with him the scent off the outside world of dust and wind and something wild. The air and the tom stirred. The ghost of Richard seemed to recoil in the corner. The first few days were a tense ballet of avoidance. I met him coffee in the morning. He would retreat to the long neglected uncertainty at the back of the house, a glass and steel bubble that Richard had assigned but never used. I learned he had come back to settle his small part off the estate, a minor inheritance. Richard cold and legally write him out of Weem, moved around each other, speaking in thick-lipped polite tones of strangers. But silence between us was different from the one I had shared with Richard. This silence was alive, teeming with thumbspoken questions and a dangerous simmering awareness. One rainy afternoon, found myself drifting toward the conservatory, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't suppress. I stood in the doorway and watched him. He wasn't painting, he was just sitting on a dusty wickered chair, staring out at the rain as it streamed down the glass panes. His face, a mask of complex emotions. He looked young and terribly lost. He never liked the rain, I said softly, making my presence known. He didn't startle at Wasis. If he'd been waiting for me, he didn't like anything he couldn't control. Julian replied, his gaze still fixed on the garden. The weather, my paintings, you. The last word was quiet, almost an afterthought, but it landed like a stone in the still pool of my composure. Is definitely don't know what you mean, don't you? Finally turned to look at me, and his blue eyes were sharp with an empath that felt like an accusation. Put you in this glass box just like his orchids, something beautiful to look at, to own, but he never opened the windows. I should have been angry, I should have defended My husband, my life, me choices, but his words were so painfully true, they bypassed my defenses and, struck at the core of a loneliness I had never dared to name. I felt a stinging behind my eyes, the traitorous born of tears. You shouldn't be here. He whispered the words of feeble defense against the truth. Probably not, he agreed, his gaze softening slightly, but then either. Should you not like this? Hadn't press further. He let the silence stretch, giving me space to breathe in thought. Moment, a fragile unspoken alien swads forged. We were two different kinds of survivors of the same emotional wreckage to people, set adrift by theism, cold, unmoving man. A week later, the storm that had been brewing inside the house manifested outside. The wind howled, throttling the old windows, and a torrential downpour lashed against the city, and then with a flicker and a power went out. The house was plunged into a sudden profound darkness, a blackness deeper than night. Claire. Julian's voice called out from the living room. Are you all right? I'm fine, I answered, my voice tight. There are candles in the kitchen. I navigated familiar layout by touch, my hand skimming over cool marble countertops. Found the candles just as he entered. With kitchen, his presence a sudden shift in the dark, a locus of warmth and an orgy. Let me, he said, his voice close behind me. I felt his fingers brush against mine as he took the book off. Matches. A tiny electric spark seemed to jump between us. He struck a match and the small flame erupted, casting orifices in a flickering dramatic glow. His, illuminated from below, looked like a Renaissance painting, all sharp angles, deep shadows, and an expression of intense concentration. He lit a candle in, then another, the kitchen filled with a soft, intimate light. We stood there for a moment, trapped in the small circle of brightness, the storm raging outside, and a different kind of storm gathering between us. I found something, I said, breaking the spell I had to. The silence was becoming too dangerous. In his desk, a locked drawer. Earlier that day I'd found a small key taped to the underside of his desk. Inside the drawer was a leather-bound journal. I hadn't read it, I couldn't. It felt like the ultimate revelation. I knew it held answers. I let him study the single candle, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. I placed it in the desk and pointed to the journal. I can't, I said, it feels wrong. More wrong than living a lie, he asked gently. He picked up the journal, his long artist fingers tracing the gold leaf tooling on the cover. He didn't open it, he just looked at me, his eyes asking for permission. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, opened it to a random page in the middle. He began to read aloud, his voice low and steady. The entry was from 10 years ago, just after Richard and I had from our honeymoon. She is perfect, Julian Reed, biddable, beautiful land, possessing a quietness that will not interfere with my work. She is a finny acquisition, she will manage the house and my legacy with grace. It is a suitable arrangement for us both. Julian. Reading, he looked up at me, his face filled with a quiet fury on my behalf. An acquisition. Not a wife, not a partner, a beautiful object to be managed. The clinical loveless words were a punch to the gut, but they were also a vindication. I wasn't crazy. The coldness I felt, the emptiness I endured, it wasn't real. It was all by design. Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to stream down my face. Not tears of grief for him, but for myself, for the young woman who had mistaken control for stability, possession for love. Hey, Julian whispered, stepping around the desk. He stood in front of me, so close he could feel the heat radiating from his booty. Claire. He reached out, not to hold me but to gently wipe a tear from my cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure unadulterated feeling that shot through my numb existence. His hand was warm and slightly loused, real in a way nothing had been for years. He never saw you, Hemmer murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He never saw any of Fish's thumb grazed my cheek. Again a slow deliberate motion. What a fool he was. He should have pulled away, I should have pointed to the door, I should have asked him for seeing the truth I had so carefully hidden. Instead, I leaned into his touch. Off flower, turning toward a long absent sun. My eyes fluttered shut, the world narrowed to this single point of contact, this small radical act of tenderness in the ghost-filled room. His other hand came up to cut my jaw, his fingers tangling in the hair at my nape. The world stopped, the storm outside, the ghosts inside, it all faded away. There was only the flickering candlelight, the scent of rain and wax, and the overwhelming, terrifying reality of the man standing in front of me. Tell me to stop, he breathed, his lips just inches from mine. The words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, my body paralyzed by a decade of repressed longing. I wanted this. I wanted to feel, to be seen, to be touched. Not as an object, but as a woman. Me. Silence was my answer. He closed this small distance between us and his lips hit mine. It wasn't a kiss of frantic passion or illicit conquest. It was slow, hesitant, and profoundly gentle. It was a question and offering, a shared confession. It tasted of salt from miters, and a sorrow that was not just mine but ours. Something inside Me, a lock thought had been rusted shut for years, broke open, a wave of feeling, grief, relief, desire, and a wild, terrifying hope crashed over me. I kissed him back, my hands coming up to grip the front of his heart, anchoring myself to him, to this only real thing in a life of artifice. It was a betrayal of a man who was gone. It was a betrayal of the role I was supposed to play, but it was the, firstly, honest thing I had done in 10 years, and in the heart of the storm, in the shadow of a dead man's legacy, infinitely terrifyingly came alive. Aftermath was not a whirlwind of guilt, but a moment of stunning, frightening clarity. We broke apart, both breathing heavily, the air thick with the consequences of our actions. The journal lay open on the desk, a silent testamento. The lie we had just destroyed. Clarihi started, but he didn't know what to say. Neither did I, and then a shrill, piercing noise cut through the house. Thepawar had returned, and with it the relentless buzz of the landline on Thetisk reality, harsh and unforgiving. Cam rushing back in, I stared at the phone, then at Julian. His face, no longer soft in the candlelight, was stark and worried. Under the electric glare, Thespel was broken. We were no longer two souls adrift in a storm. We were a widow and her young brother-in-law standing in her dead husband's study, having just crossed an unforgivable line. I answered its phone. It was the estate lawyer, a man as dry and brittle as old parchment cling to schedule a meeting. I agreed, me voice a hollow echo of its usual calm one. I hung up. Julian was watching me, his expression unreadable. He left the next morning. We didn't talk about Thakith. We didn't need to. It was a living thing between us now, a shared secret that both bound and separated us. Hesimly said, "I'll be in touch," and walked out the door, leaving behind a Solence that was once again empty, but no, charged with possibility. Weeks later, I stand in the study now. My study, theg host of Richard, is gone, exercised not by time but by a single moment of forbidden truth. I have put the house on the market. This beautiful gilded cage is no longer my home, it was his, my life. Forth first time is an unwritten page. It is terrifying, it is exhilarating. With the pand between Julian and me wasn't a solution, it was a catalyst. It was the desperate, beautiful, and devastating act off to people choosing to live, even if it meant shattering the piece of thud ed. We learn that our greatest betrayals are rarely against others, they are against the truth of who we are. The most dangerous ghosts are not the spirits of those we've lost, but the specters we become when we live a life that is not our own. The real haunting is the silence of a soul that has been ended a voice for far too long. If you find yourself captivated by the hidden currents of human emotion and the complex ties that bind us even in grief, then subscribe to our channel. Delve into the stories that explores moments when life, messy and unpredictable, breaks through the pristine surface of what's expected.